Before we start our second session, I want to welcome our distinguished member of our community and our president, Jim Ryan, to come up and share with us his thoughts on the Grand Challenges initiative that he's so supportive of. Jim?
Hi, everyone. I've been told to tell you that I'm actually Mike Lennox. I missed the early part, but so it's great to see all of you. I want to begin with some word of thanks and then put this in some context. I'm sure Liz talked a little bit about this already, but I will underscore hopefully what she said. So first, thanks to Liz and to Ram and to Megan for organizing this event, and I think they deserve a round of applause. It was a lot of work. So in terms of putting this in context, I think the first thing to recognize is how unusual this gathering is. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time in meetings where we wonder how we're going to do more with less, and we're talking about budget cuts. It's not many meetings or events that I'm a participant in where the question is, how can we best spend money, and how can we best make a big investment? And that's essentially what this is about. To give you some sense of the background here, so in the strategic plan that we put together a couple of years ago now, we identified 5 areas of research that we really wanted to focus attention on and to invest in. And they are democracy, precision medicine, the brain and neuroscience, digital technology and society, and environmental resilience and sustainability. This is not to say that that's the only research that's going to happen at UVA or that's the only research that is going to be invested in, but these were the areas we thought we would make significant investments in rather than spread funding out like peanut butter. And the reason that we chose these 5 are, one, each one of them is an area of importance to our democracy, to our society, to human flourishing. The other is that it was our belief that we're poised to make important discoveries in each of these areas in the next 10 years or so. And the third is that in each of these areas, we would be building on strength, and strength across the university, which means across disciplines and across schools. And the idea is to make significant investments in each of these areas. We've made an investment in democracy already, and this year we're going to make significant investments in the brain and neuroscience and environmental resilience and sustainability. And it's not an investment in directly funding research, but it's more about investing in the infrastructure and the people who will help produce the research, so doctoral students or postdoctoral students or additional faculty. And as for environmental resilience and sustainability, it hits all of the criteria perfectly. This is obviously an important area of research, not just to the university, but to the rest of the world. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say climate change represents an existential challenge. So it's hard to have an area that's more important than that. It's also an area where I think we are poised to make important discoveries, and in fact, in some ways, we have to make important discoveries over the next 10 to 15 years. And third, it's an area where there is strength across the university and a track record of interdisciplinary work across a range of topics from climate adaptability in coastal Virginia to the Arctic, to research around removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, research on the intersection of environmental policy and racial justice, and research on building better infrastructure to be able to withstand climate change. And here, I want to give thanks to my predecessor, Terry Sullivan, and Liz's predecessor, Tom Katsouleas, for helping to create the Environmental Resilience Institute in 2017, as well as those of you who have been involved in the Institute, because it's helped coordinate and spur a good deal of this work. So in a sense, and I'll end here, the question before you is a challenging one, but hopefully it's an exciting and an energizing one, which is how can the university best make an investment in this area, which really comes down to asking, what are the most important questions that we're poised to answer? What are the most important discoveries we're poised to make? What are the most important puzzles that we are poised to solve? And what are the resources that we need in order to answer those questions, in order to make those discoveries, and in order to solve those puzzles? So thank you for participating in this. Thanks for the work that you're doing. And I'm looking forward to hearing what the next panel has to say. And thanks for letting me barge in on your conference. Thank you.
President Ryan, thank you for your support, guidance, and framing of this problem in no uncertain terms, how important it is to humanity. Thank you. As we had the first panel on mitigation, what can we do about making a change, reverse the course, whatnots? The second panel is going to talk about things are changing, how can we adapt? So this is climate adaptation, resilient cities. Moderator is Karen McGlathery. Please, panelists, please come up. We have Brad Cantrell, Jonathan Goodall, Jenny Rowe, and Jay Shimshack.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. And as with the previous panel, I will give some very brief comments to frame the issue that we'll be talking about today. And then we'll hear from our four panelists initially on what they think the big questions are from their disciplinary perspective. And then we'll talk about the sort of two moonshot ideas that we have, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So as President Ryan just said, climate change is an existential challenge. The problem is as enormous as it is urgent. The estimates are that 85% of the world's population are living or will live in a place that's affected by climate extremes, whether that's a flood or a heat wave or drought or storm. And this is especially acute on the coasts, about half of the world's population lives on the coast or within 100 miles of the coast, and that includes 11 of the 14 largest cities in the world. So the coastlines are really ground zero for climate change impacts, and we will be focusing our comments primarily on coastal cities. This is, as I mentioned, a hugely urgent problem. There are estimates that by 2050, so that's less than 30 years, 150 million people will need to move away from the coasts. So whether you call them climate migrants or climate refugees, this is a huge issue that they have to deal with. And I was struck in the last panel by some of the numbers that Deborah Lawrence put out. Maybe 10% of the carbon emission reduction can be done by nature. That's a big number, but it's also a small number. Technology, we still have a long way to go. And so even if we are able to mitigate climate, like we talked about in the previous panel, all communities are going to have to adapt. It is just our reality. And some communities will also have to think about that larger issue of migration. Just a couple examples. Think about Miami. Miami has about 500,000 people that live just 3 feet above sea level, so that's within the range that we expect in the next 30 years in terms of sea level rise. Storms, the quote, 100-year storm, those are happening and will happen every few years. So it is their reality. There's a $1 trillion economy that has to be adjusted to deal with climate change. How will those people adapt, and where will they go if they need to go? It's not just a national problem, it's an international problem. The city of Manila, Manila in the Philippines is one of the most densely populated cities in the world. 1.8 million people live right at sea level. Where are they going to go? Will they move across international boundaries? How will we address this? So as we heard in the last panel, it's not just a science question, it's not just an economics question, it's not just a question of politics, it's a question of all of those. And so we're going to hear now we're going to go down the line. We've set everybody up very strategically. So John will start, and just 3 minutes about what the big questions are from your perspective.
All right, thanks Karen. Hi, everyone. My name is John Goodall. I'm a professor in the engineering school. I do civil engineering is my training. I'm also associate director for the Link Lab, where we focus on cyber-physical systems. And I've been working in the community in Norfolk and Hampton Roads over the last few years, so that's really informing a lot of my thinking on this work, kind of on the ground within cities, how they're thinking and adapting to this climate change challenge. So for me, I think important questions are, first, how do we measure what's happening now on the ground at a much denser scale than we currently are able to? A lot of decisions are being made off of one tide gauge or a handful of rainfall gauges, and we just don't know the dynamics that are happening in a very changing, rapidly changing environment. So if you don't have a lot of data to make decisions, you're probably going to make poor decisions. So step one, I think, is increasing the amount of data that we're collecting through innovative information, Internet of Things types of technologies that we're working on in the engineering school. Secondly, when I think about infrastructure, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, we've been designing infrastructure that has some conditions behind it, assumptions of a static environment, for example. What do we do now that the environment is changing? How do we design infrastructure that keeps people safe, but not a false sense of security for some locations that are going to have to migrate over time? So thinking about innovative ways of having both green and gray infrastructure. So seawalls where appropriate, but also things like living with the water, nature-based solutions are also a big part of what we need to think about when we think about coastal cities in the future. Third, I think we need to create new ways of modeling and coming up with flood risk. So flood risk, again, has been a very static thing. We create 100-year flood maps and we assume that's it. We need to be able to reassess these very quickly, rapidly with fresh data to know what areas are at risk so that we can plan appropriately for new development. And lastly, I think we really need to think about communities that are going to be impacted by this in ways that beyond their means potentially. So I'm thinking about things like environmental gentrification. So in Norfolk in particular, I'm thinking about people moving away from areas of risk to ridgelines within Norfolk that are predominantly Black communities. So how do we think about that process too as we think about migration even within a city itself, let alone migration away from the coast?
My name is Brad Cantrell. I'm chair and professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture. In the School of Architecture, you'll find a kind of a range of ways of approaching issues around resilient cities. My research has developed primarily over the last decade or so in southern Louisiana before coming to UVA. And a lot of my work is really dealing on much more on the technological side. And so John and I have a lot of the same kind of recommendations for what we see. Part of this is the idea that, many of the kind of areas we inhabit, as Karen has described, are in rapidly changing landscapes. And a lot of the tension we see in this is the development of those inhabitations, the infrastructures which have been developed as kind of static entities, being slowly unraveled by a really vicious and vigorous landscape that's undergoing change. So one of the issues here is how do we gather information, both physiotemporal data, but also sociocultural data about how these places are changing, and how do we begin to integrate that into systems that are transparent and open and allow people to have access to understand what that information is. The other aspect is that our typical approach to protect our cities has been really large in scale. It's really thought of as kind of a one-size-fits-all or one giant-size-fits-all solution. My belief, I think John shares this as well, is that we have to begin to develop much smaller scale types of infrastructure to help protect our coastal communities, but that also work not only to protect our cities, but also work to help enhance the ecological systems that are surrounding that in the environments. And then the last part is that not only do we need to begin to develop these kind of mitigation strategies, but we need to do this in tandem while looking ahead and to think a bit about how not only are we developing these infrastructures to protect us today, but that we're also setting the groundwork for what it might mean in the future to actually leave some of these coastal communities and then what we're leaving behind, which will essentially be a new kind of vacant or post-industrial landscape that is sitting directly on the edge of our coasts. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks to all of you. I'm delighted to be here, and it's a humbling group to be a part of. So I'm Jay Shimshack. I'm a professor of public policy and economics and the associate dean for academic affairs at the Batten School. I'm interested in policy design and implementation, including the social and behavioral science elements of environmental resilience. Some important research questions from my perspective in this area include how are we going to protect vulnerable areas along the lines that John and Brad discussed in ways that don't provide incentives for people to deliberately take on increased risk. So fundamentally, knowing about public protections as well as a commitment to bail people out, how do we keep them from taking on unusual amounts of risk? Economists call this moral hazard. A second question that I think is particularly interesting in this area is what does effective risk management communication and emergency preparation look like in this context? How do we design policies to help people overcome their systematic biases in processing risk information? Unfortunately, we all have a lot of direct experience with this lately. We are an incredibly irrational bunch, especially around scary events like climate risk. And then third, again, as John and Karen and others have mentioned and will continue to mention, how do we mitigate risk in an equitable fashion? We know that holding the world's current conditions constant, the distributional effects of climate change will be highly unequal, and they'll fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable populations. This is true domestically, and it's true around the world. But the world won't be static. We aren't in the situation where the current conditions will be held constant. And regrettably, this will likely make things more unequal without super thoughtful, systematic, and very difficult policy choices. We will see migration away from some risky areas, but that out-migration will disproportionately occur among advantaged households. The increased risks and out-migration will lead to things like lower property values and lower rents, and that may actually encourage in-migration of vulnerable populations to the riskiest areas. As we make infrastructure investments to protect some risky places, but not all, and we know that it won't be all, the more protected areas will experience higher rents and higher property values, again driving away the vulnerable and disproportionately benefiting privileged populations. So these are just a few of the sorts of questions, a social behavioral perspective on these topics. I'm flailing here. A few of the interesting social behavioral questions, but I'll stop there. Jenny?
Thank you, Jay. Hello, everybody. I'm Jenny Rowe. I am an environmental psychologist in the School of Architecture. Environmental psychology as a discipline tends to draw a blank amongst most people I meet in the world, so I'm going to spend a tiny minute explaining what it is. So EP, for short, explores how people interact with their environment, their relationship with that environment, and how that affects their health, well-being, and behavior. By environment, I mean both the physical and the social environment. It emerged from two interrelated but distinct disciplines. First, conservation psychology, which is really interested in what drives sustainability behaviors. And the second, architectural psychology, which is the study of the built environment and how it impacts health and well-being. These two themes intersect around people's relationship to nature, which is where my research largely sits. But today I'm talking in more general terms about psychology and what psychology can offer to this climate emergency debate. So we are focused on individual behaviors. You've heard, I think, from the previous session how important that is and how it sits within the wider system. Individual behaviors don't operate in isolation. They work in tandem with policy, with governance, with infrastructure change, and with technology change. But let's just take a look at the scale of the problem in relation to individual behaviors. So a recent global survey of 10 countries has shown that very few people are actually willing to change their own lifestyles to help with this issue. 62% of people in that survey reported that they thought climate change was our most pressing societal issue. It was carried out, remember, in a pandemic. They put climate change above the pandemic as a concern, but they were lukewarm in changing their own habits. So let's take a look at carbon emissions, for instance. 15% of carbon emissions are from our vehicles, light vehicles that we drive on a daily basis. Only 25% of those surveyed were willing to think about changing to public transit over their own cars. Now, as I said, this sits in a system. People can't change their behavior unless they have the opportunity to do so, and they need the infrastructure, they need the public transit, and they need the walkable communities to be able to do that. So the kind of questions we're wrestling with really is what sorts of behavior change strategies might change these patterns, what kind of messaging, which ones scientifically work, in what demographic group, and how these can be applied to advance change. And of current interest really in the field is the cost and the impact of climate change on mental illness and what we call eco-anxiety. Tom Bateman was actually writing in UVA today, Tom is from McIntyre, about the issue of hopelessness. It's particularly profound in our young people right now. And how can we build agency? So these are the kind of issues that psychologists like myself, social psychologists in Batten, across the university are interested in addressing. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you all. For those of you who listened to or followed the COP26 meeting last week, there was a statistic that I found really remarkable from Janet Yellen, who's the US Treasury Secretary. And she noted that the price tag for climate adaptation globally is $100 trillion. So again, just putting an exclamation point on the scale of this issue. What we're going to do now is we have organized our comments and our thoughts around two moonshot questions, I guess I would put. One is related, and they are focused on the timescale over which we're thinking about these issues. The first is, over the short term, how do we best prepare coastal cities for climate shocks and minimize damages in a way that promotes equity? We'll hear from our panelists, their comments both on where UVA, what we need at UVA, where our strengths are, and how we can really make an impact on this question. And then the follow-up question that we'll go through is, over the longer term, how do we plan for the inevitable migration that some communities will face? So we'll first start with the shorter term adaptation, and we'll do the same thing, just 3 minutes each, folks.
All right, thanks, Karen. So this is a short time frame type of situation here. How do cities adapt over the short timeline? And I think there's a lot of strengths at UVA, but maybe some gaps too that we can fill to further strengthen our kind of expertise within this area. So first is, I think we need to have really the ability to really model the systems well, do projections well at a local scale. So there's a lot of talk about global scale modeling, even regional scale modeling, but that doesn't really help these communities that are trying to make decisions on the ground about what to do. So how do we bring some expertise that can allow us to downscale some of that information and really strengthen our ability to inform that local decision making? So I do think we have a lot of strength at UVA in climate science, environmental science in this area, but looking at our peers, I think we're behind, and we need to really strengthen that area. Secondly, and this reflects a lot what the panel said, the last panel said, this is really a systems problem at the end of the day. A lot of components coming together. So we need more people that are willing to kind of think about it as a system, bring their own expertise to the table, but really engage in plugging in with others to try to analyze it as a system. So as we just generally think about hiring new faculty, thinking about that and mechanisms at the university to hire people that we know will fit in that and have that larger systems context to work on problems like this. So from my perspective in the Link Lab at the engineering school, we do have a lot of expertise from the level of designing a chip and a sensor, making them power efficient, all these important technical problems. But how do you actually get that out into the community? I think there could be more expertise on the application side of some of this Internet of Things technology that would really benefit communities. And the same is true for cyber-physical systems in general. If we think about this adaptive infrastructure that can have real-time sensing connected with algorithms that control things like how gates and valves open within a drainage network within a city, we need more folks that kind of think about that and work on that problem to maximize the strengths in the Link Lab, connecting with landscape architecture, connecting with ERI as well. And lastly, I'll say that we're doing some amazing work here, connecting across physical systems, technology, and people. But I think there's more that we can do. So I'm still learning about amazing things that we have here, working with colleagues in the Equity Center. I learned recently and started working with colleagues in the Repair Lab. And we're all thinking about similar things from different angles. And I think ERI is really, really amazing at bringing some of that together. So if we could do ERI times 5 or times 10 to really pull in all the pieces, I think that would be a really great thing for UVA and set us apart.
Great. Yeah, Karen didn't make us say that.
I didn't.
And one of the huge strengths of UVA is what I would say is a commitment to multidisciplinary research. I mean, it's in my opinion, a university that prides itself in this, and it's something that I think we can continue to tap into in order to address many of these issues. And in the short term, we have a lot of expertise already, as John's mentioned, in the School of Architecture, in community engagement, in design technologies, and cultural landscapes. I think in the environmental sciences, kind of range of ways of modeling the environment, and then kind of deep knowledge in hydrology and ecology, and then in the Link Lab, an approach to what I would call responsive technologies or smart technologies that really would help kind of develop these types of adaptive infrastructures. So what we need in my mind is sort of like ERI times 5, but in many ways it's an investment in collaborative research environments. This isn't just laboratories, this isn't just kind of academic environments, here on grounds, but it's also sites we can engage. It's getting out into the physical world and beginning to prototype and experiment at one-to-one. And I think this is a critical aspect of our next steps in terms of developing new approaches to the environment and adaptive infrastructures. The other piece in that is that also needs to be meshed with forms of community engagement, being able to work with communities directly, understand their needs, and how these technologies might impact them, and we can talk a bit about more on that in the kind of long-term kind of ideas. And then I would go back to the same kind of investment in faculty as ways to build links across disciplines and really kind of shore up some of those moments.
So the question is, how do we best prepare for climate shocks and minimize damages in a way that is equitable and cost-effective? And just for the record, it's very important, the cost-effective part. If we don't do this in a way that's cost-effective, we will see much less of it, just full stop. So that's an important part of this conversation. In terms of UVA strengths, I think we've heard, and many of us have witnessed this firsthand, we have an institutional commitment to address environmental resilience and sustainability and related issues like social mobility, and that's the first and most important place to start. We also, as demonstrated by my colleagues here in the first panel, we have an incredibly talented mix of natural scientists, applied scientists, and engineers. We have health scholars, design thinkers, social behavioral scientists. We have an amazing group here as a starting point. I think it's useful to imagine that for the infrastructure questions we were talking about, this requires a richer understanding of the location, the timing, the nature of climate risks themselves, and the honest truth is climate systems are incredibly complicated and we have an awfully long way to go. when we get to the questions like what are the right incentives from a policy perspective, how do we manage communication to get people to manage risks in their own lives, and from a public perspective, how do we do this in an equitable and efficient way, I think there are some indications as to areas that we may need or at least would benefit from. So when I think about what UVA needs in this space, as my colleagues and predecessors have mentioned, UVA would benefit from people that can help connect the natural and applied sciences to the worlds of law and policy. And there are a lot of world-class social and behavioral scientists that are well positioned to serve that role. I think we might also benefit from broadening our aspirations for research impact itself. So I think considering additional metrics for research impact, like engagement with policymakers, research practitioner partnerships with external stakeholders like businesses, NGOs, the policy community, government agencies, and having a direct impact, as Brad just mentioned, on our communities. So that's what I was thinking.
Thank you, Jay. So there are many co-benefits to health and well-being from the types of strategies that John and Brad are advancing, both in terms of hard and soft infrastructure. But health very much tends to be the add-on piece. When I talk to chief commissioners of large US cities, they're not thinking about health when they're thinking of perhaps putting in a green stormwater retention pool. But there are benefits to health and well-being from access to nature and access to recreation facilities that that pool offers. So here at UVA, we really need to galvanize our medical school and our School of Nursing. There's actually a talk tomorrow, Medical Hour, 12 till 1, about why we need climate doctors. I'd add that we need climate doctors and climate nurses. I think we have them. I just don't think they have the time to come to the table, so we need to find time for them. We have behavioral scientists scattered around the university. We have them in the School of Curry. We have them in Batten. Jean Braithwaite in 2016 tried to bring us all together under an initiative called Behavioral Science in the Public Interest. Unfortunately, that initiative wasn't funded. So we need to find resources to bring, I think, both our medics and our nurses and our people interested in human behavior to the table. And what else do we need? I'm looking at Mark now. We need health economists for cost-benefit analyses, both of the benefits of these infrastructure-type strategies to health and well-being, but also the cost of climate-driven mental illness and eco-anxiety. So I'm going to put a word in for psychiatric epidemiologists to help map some of those mental health issues too.
Thank you all. So now I want to sort of extend our time frame to think about the possibility of long-term migration and what you think about in terms of planning for the inevitable migration that some communities on the coast in cities might face. So John, I guess we'll do the same.
All right. So when I think about longer time frames, my mind, and I'm an engineer, so I don't think about this long time frame outside of kind of building infrastructure or something like that, but my mind goes to policy. So what does it mean to create policies that allow people to move out of areas of risk and not allow people to build in areas of risk? I think it's a fundamental rethinking about flood insurance policies and building codes and all of these things that are really, really important long time frame solutions to some of the migration issues. So that makes me think that what can we do better at UVA to connect engineering and policy, the Batten School. I know other programs across the country do have a better integration between programs for PhD students, and maybe that's something that we should think about here. I agree very much with what the last panel was saying about, more opportunities we can provide for PhD students that are really going to be leaders in this space and help us think through it is a really important thing to do. And I really do want to say that, we have a lot of expertise at UVA around modeling flooding, and I think that is a really important piece of the puzzle and something that we can really invest in as well. If we can create more dynamic abilities to model at scale, high-performance computing capabilities, machine learning, AI capabilities, to really redefine how we characterize flood risk compared to the way that we do it right now. So just for context, the way we do it now is very much a physical model system that can only be done every few years, tremendously expensive to do through FEMA and other organizations. And that means we just don't know what the risk is for a lot of places, or we knew what the risk was 10 years ago, which is not helpful when the environment is changing. So I think we can really lead in that space as well. And lastly, this is going to be a long-term an envisioning exercise that I think we really need to draw on strengths from, and I think of architecture and design in that space. What is it going to look like for coastal cities in the future? How can we envision that? Both, I don't think the cities will, they're going to have to change within, as well as some folks will have to leave potentially, but how do we think through all that? How do we think about cities that are inland that are going to grow in population and do that in a sustainable way as well? So there's a lot of thought I think we can do around these future cities, if you will.
So I think part of this long-term look is very much about uncertainty. It's the idea that we have an idea of where we're headed, but we really can't be certain about what's next, and how we begin to address that. And so these are, in my opinion, requires us to really think through the kind of bifurcating processes of planning and design for what will essentially be this new coastal condition. It's a place that we really haven't seen before. It's a place of abandonment, almost like the shrinking cities movement, like Detroit and like some of our cities in the Midwest. And what does that mean as we are helping people find new homes in interior cities? And how do we start to, as John's saying, envision that, but also plan for that? My take here is that it's not a top-down process, and it needs to kind of embrace like a much more kind of plural way of seeing these cities and individuals. In my opinion, UVA has the strengths to help synthesize a kind of broad range of ideas, but doesn't necessarily have the capacity at the moment to reach out to these communities and engage them where they are. My take on this is that, like we saw with the land-grant universities and the cooperative extension programs, that there could be some form of a cooperative extension for resilient futures that starts to take the research, the kind of advancements that are happening in the academy, and begins to cooperate with communities, think about applied projects, and then use those applied projects as their own forms of research, while also gaining knowledge from those communities and working directly with them. In a way, a kind of transfer between kind of very localized knowledge and the knowledge that's happening here in labs and funded research. So I think this idea of engagement is extremely important, and that UVA would be well served to find ways to embed themselves in these communities, to build trust, to not necessarily educate those communities, but to educate ourselves on what the needs are for these places.
Planning for inevitable migration, I think it's really interesting to think not just about the challenges that the communities experiencing out-migration will face, but those experiencing in-migration, I think is also equally interesting. Fundamentally, the notion of climate and migration is such a complicated technical problem, it's such a complicated social problem, and its implications for equity, for social well-being, for mental health are really, really extraordinary. So when I think about what we need for this question, the first thing that comes to my mind is we have an amazing number of people at UVA who can inform these questions. To my knowledge, we have very few, if any, that are really spending a lot of their effort focused on this question as a core area of their research program. So I think that would go a very long way in terms of being a force multiplier for getting these kind of innovative and important long-term questions resolved. The other thing I'll say is that if we want to take the urban and cities part of this conversation seriously, I think that we might benefit from some additional investments in sort of urban areas. We have some amazing people in planning and in architecture, but there are other areas, urban economics, for example, that I think we could build in. Stop there, Jenny.
Thank you. So capturing the impacts of migration on mental health is particularly important, both from the perspective of those who are moved or have to move, and as Jay has just spoken about, from the perspective of those who are receiving the influx of these migrants. And the effects of all of this on mental health ranges in severity across the spectrum, from post-traumatic stress disorder to the destruction of community, to our sense of place belonging and our sense of place attachment, critical dimensions for both our individual and community well-being. So we need to grow this research. As Jay has said and others have said, we have the capacity here. We have people who understand cognitive and the psychological effects, let's say, of PTSD in other contexts, but we need to be applying that skill set to this particular problem, focusing on displacement. And I, because I'm in the School of Architecture, I see the creativity and the imagination in that school. And my mind goes to really new city models, and we need them fast. Historically, we've not been terribly good at advancing new city models. Utopian visions like Ebenezer Howard's City Garden movement really didn't result in satisfactory new towns on the ground. So we need that imagination, we need to be daring, we need to be robust, and we need to do it with the community, as just about everybody on this panel has already mentioned. I think we also need the humanities, so we need to look at historical precedents. I'm going to make a case for geography. We need to work across geographic borders. What are the cultural implications of people shifting across borders? And we need new social systems to manage this process, particularly bringing in our colleagues from the social sciences. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Well, you all did a great job keeping on track with time. We're actually a little bit ahead of schedule. So I'm glad you raised that last point about including the humanities. During the Grand Challenges Forum, there were a lot of comments from people in the arts and humanities. And so that connection, I think, is really important. And I hope there's some people in the audience who will bring that up. So we heard some common themes about, same as we heard in the previous panel, about systems approach, this being a very dynamic, not a static issue that we're having to deal with. So whatever we do has to be able to change and be nimble as the climate change impacts, and adaptation solutions have to change and be nimble. And also, I think we'll hear about it in the next panel in terms of the community engagement from the very beginning of the process. So I think now we have an opportunity for questions, comments from the audience. Cheryl and others are going to be going around with microphones. Yeah, that's fine. I can't really see.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. It's been very interesting. My name is Jordan Love. I'm the academic curator at the Fralin Museum of Art. And one of our mottos when we're creating community programming is nothing about us without us. So anytime we're reaching out to a community, we deeply involve them, and we're connected with churches and schools and after-school programs and daycares. And but one of the things that also concerns us is 25.2% of all museums are located in a critical coastal vulnerability area. And both the New Orleans Museum of Art and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, when they went through Katrina and Harvey, were largely on their own. And some of our colleagues had to choose between staying with the art and evacuating their families and their homes. And now the Chrysler is in trouble. So, and their basement has flooded 3 times in the past decade. And I'm really interested to hear whether, for those of you who have worked with Norfolk, whether there has been any talk about cultural heritage and moving our cultural heritage inland as well, because we're starting to get the feeling like we're on our own and we got to figure it out on our own. Our current collections manager is training FEMA in DC because they don't have a plan. So anyway, I'd love to hear more about that. Thank you.
John, do you want to take that?
So think I heard most of what your question was, but I didn't catch all of it. But it was about art within Norfolk in particular, and how do we save that from increasing flood risk? And there's not a lot of conversation that you're hearing about it. I don't have a great answer. I'm not hearing a lot of conversation about it either. But that's a good example of yet another wrinkle to this problem. So this is a very valuable resource within a flood risk area. Are we going to try to protect that, move it? I think it's just one example. I mean, I hear a lot more, of course, about the Navy base in Norfolk as well. But it's basically kind of a similar question at the end of the day. What can we protect in place? What are we going to need to move? How do we find the resources to move it? So I don't have a great answer for you, but I would say I've not heard a lot of talk about that either, which is concerning.
I have a question. I don't want to. Deborah, will you go next? So I think many of you on the panel in the room were zoomed into the Climate Ambition Summit, where Arun Majumdar said a lot of really fascinating things. One of the things he said in a conversation with President Ryan was one of our greatest challenges was to take our global or broadly regional understandings of climate and bring them to a kind of actionable level at a local or regional level so that decision makers could do the kinds of things you've been talking about. And I'm just curious about your own perspectives about our strengths, UVA, in that area. Are we well positioned to do that? What would we need to do it better? Do you think this is part of the special sauce we have that we could bring that to the table in terms of the future?
You probably all have something to say about that. Do you want to start, John?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think in some ways this is the P2PE grant that we got is going to help us bridge that gap. So, Link Lab, we have a lot of people wanting to create sensors and measure things and kind of Internet of Things. Obviously, we can measure things in the environment. Now, from my perspective, it's expensive to do so. There's a power issue where you have to figure out how to power it, but there's a lot of innovation happening where how can we make the sensors really low power? How can we make them run off batteries so we can just deploy them? How can we do that at scale? So that will give us the information kind of on the ground, if you will. And then the climate models, as they get finer and finer resolution, the algorithms for downscaling them get better and better. Eventually there'll be a connection across those. Where are we right now? I think we have strengths in the Link Lab that are kind of, in other places too, environmental science, a lot of people doing monitoring. And then, we have some strength maybe that could be further strengthened on the kind of modeling side. And we're in a good place to make that connection, especially with the new P2PE funding coming in.
Yeah, just for clarity on that project is focused on supporting postdocs who are advised by faculty members in different schools. And the gaps that we identified and opportunities were geospatial analysis. So we heard about that in the previous panel. Modeling, using artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the third was agent-based modeling. So really linking the people's decisions with some of the biophysical aspects. And so that project will produce at the end of 5 years 3 young faculty members. But I think part of the argument was there's a great synergy there, and there could be opportunities for even more focus in that area. I was just following up on the reference to the P2PE.
I mean, I'll go back to my last comment and kind of thinking long term, but I think this investment in engagement with local communities is extremely important. There are, I think, I don't know about other schools, but in the School of Architecture, there's a lot of expertise in community engagement, but not necessarily the resources for kind of for long-term relationships, particularly relationships that are not, I would say, extractive. And so that I think finding ways to kind of resource those efforts and to allow that knowledge transfer to work in both directions. That not only are we helping to consult and support, but that we're also using that as a way to guide our own research and our own actions here in the Academy.
I would start by just saying ditto. Those comments are perfect. But I think in terms of strengths, the historical perspective and historical context, I think we have some wonderful people doing work on that. Politics, polarization, advocacy, benefits and costs of action and inaction, equity issues. I think we have quite a few people really interested in precisely that move from a global understanding down to actionable level, both at the policy and the community level.
Well, psychologists are working at relatively local scales, small scales. I would say we really have a big gap and need in this university for epidemiologists who can crunch the data at a global and a national scale that then psychology can then advance and unpick. And just to the other point about cultural heritage, super important for people's health and well-being, and for the sense of community and the vitality of that community, that they can connect to the cultural heritage. So it really is important that we advance that discussion.
I already had a chance to talk. I'll talk quickly. One question I have is, as I listen to you all talk, I'm thinking, are we imagining a slow, gradual change, or are we also kind of thinking like, oh my gosh, what if it's an episodic change? The coast, it's like where we're gonna feel Greenland when it all goes away. It's where we feel big storms suddenly, like nonlinear changes on the coast, because suddenly it's like high tide is no longer a tide, but a flood. So to what extent is that kind of, notion of change part of our future conversation?
You want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's, I don't think it's distributed evenly. I think it's actually, there are certain communities that will be forced to change very quickly, and there'll be other places, like Island of Manhattan will build huge walls around itself before it will have to actually migrate away. And so this kind of uneven distribution is, I think, one of the key issues, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all type of issue. I do think there are certain communities that are 2 back-to-back storms away from being wiped out, and we see this in southern Louisiana, that it's very kind of precarious condition, and I think that will advance in coastal Virginia as well. So I think those are the key factors there, that it's not evenly distributed, and that it's going to be very slow in some places, and then like overnight in others.
I'll just add there, it's both, right, at some level, because a large storm can come through and make quick change, but as the sea level is rising, obviously there's going to be a change just from that alone, but that sea level rising, is changing the drainage, the ability for the land to drain. So even not a mega storm, but a sort of large storm could also have large impacts. So they're interacting in that kind of that way, and the long term is kind of known, but there could be these quick, abrupt storms that make change very fast, depending on where storms happen to go over the next coming decades.
You don't have to, if you have something, okay. I mean, I think you also raised, that's one of the big issues, I think, in thinking about migration, is like, at what point is it time to leave, right? And is it going to be some slow, gradual ascent to some point where you say, or is it just is there going to be some tipping point or some big event? And will everyone have the same opportunities? No, they won't. And so how do you prepare for that? Did Larry had a question, and then.
Hi. My name is Alec Polov. Sorry, my name is Alec Polov. I'm a chemistry graduate student here at UVA. I have a kind of a antithetical question about cities itself. Do you think that we are focusing too much on cities as they are currently? And what room is there to consider instead of, as people will inevitably move from these coastal cities, do you think there's room to expand upon whether they move into inland cities, or whether we need to re-examine the idea of what a city is? Or are there alternatives to simply relocating people from one city to another without adaptation? Because currently, there's a lot of problems with current city infrastructure.
Right, so I think that's a really important point, really about whether we're limiting our focus too much on cities and whether we should be thinking more about communities, because there is, one could argue there's not a very distinct mark between a city, a boundary, and the rural area that is connected to it or may support it. People aren't necessarily going to move to a city, they might move to a rural area. And so I could just say from my perspective, and then I'll pass it on, is that the rural coastal communities or rural communities in general are really not well served by data and science and research as much as cities. So there's a real need there. And we have a big interdisciplinary program that was just funded that's working on that. So there's some opportunities to connect those two. But that's a really good point. And does anybody, our city person?
I'm the landscape person, but I mean, I think there's definitely an opportunity to kind of rethink our settlement patterns. I don't think by talking about cities that we're negating the other aspects of landscape and land in general. And in many ways, our city's life and the way they thrive is based on their connection to other types of landscape and their productivity. So I think that it all goes hand in hand when we're talking about this. I will agree in one sense, though, that the idea that we need to think about different ways we're settling the kind of interior territories in these cases is key. And so that gives us an opportunity to kind of rethink those situations. There's also, I think, you know, in this kind of rethinking, there's a series, and this was kind of talked about in the last panel, there's attachments to land that go beyond like the plot of land you own, your house on it, but it comes down to kind of a generational attachment to land. And there are examples in southern Louisiana even where people have given up their land on the coast for settlement farther inland, but then they have certain rights back to that land to carry out certain traditional ceremonies or even family hunting rights and things like this. So there are different models for this that I think can start to get embedded into the way we rethink this migration and what a city is and what settlement is.
I think we have a model right now. It's taking place in front of us because of COVID-19. The wealthy in London, New York, have moved out to wherever, leaving a vast tract of empty office buildings and empty apartments downtown. So I think it's about finding the right strategy for the right demographic. So young people would be very keen, I would imagine, to move downtown into those empty office blocks if they were properly purposed. They might, you know, older people don't necessarily want to live in the rural communities. I don't know, but there's something happening at the minute which I think we need to take note of. I don't think our cities are dead at all, but I think it's about repurposing for the kinds of people who want to live there.
I would just add, I'm not particularly inclined to take over the medium to long run sort of anything as fixed and totally immutable. There are some things that change very slowly in the world, but when I think about the often sort of depressing issue of climate change, the one sort of ray of hope is that defined over the long run, we have a remarkable history of adaptation and responding in ways to challenges over the long run that involve changes and positive developments for human welfare for the average member of the population, and even over a very long time period for the most vulnerable members of our populations as well.
Larry?
So this was, to a great extent, my question. We're talking about cities, but it's part of one larger interconnected system that's both globally and locally interconnected. I've worked in China for more than 30 years, and we used to work in isolated regions where the tertiary and quaternary cities were about the size of Charlottesville. When we go back, there were 1 million to 2 million people cities. So for this area, where we're sitting right now, if there's a large migration from the coast, it doesn't necessarily come here, but it's going to come to some areas that are much smaller, and it's going to be a large expansion. So this is not a retrofit, which is what we're talking about when we talk about modifying current urban environment. It's a new build, and it's a realignment of this urban to rural gradient. Any comments about what's taking place at the coast? Karen brought up, If you have 150,000, 200,000 people moving, where do they move to? Where's the infrastructures and ties? Both short-term, I mean, when Katrina hit New Orleans, the population of Baton Rouge rose dramatically, and Houston as well for a period of time, then rebounded, but there was a lot of permanent new settlement in those areas. What are the implications for where we are right now, or similar secondary or tertiary cities?
Thanks, Larry.
I mean, if we take some of the example of Hurricane Katrina and the migration from New Orleans, as you mentioned in Baton Rouge, everyone came to the areas that could be built the quickest at the time, and the suburbs expanded, tremendously around Baton Rouge. I think this is where longer-term planning efforts and the allocation of land for development needs to be thought through. It can't just be the kind of weakest, in a way, the weakest point where everyone kind of goes to for the cheapest. It has to be thought out in a kind of much more synthetic way. So I don't really have an answer for that, but from the examples we've seen, without planning, it's been taken on in this way with the kind of cheapest and quickest kind of forms of development.
I'm just going to throw out an idea. It's becoming more popular, the idea of the 15-minute or 20-minute neighborhood, so that everything you have, your life, your work, your recreation takes place within a 15-minute journey, be it on public transit or bike or by walking. So Portland, Melbourne, and actually Scotland on a national scale are advancing this idea. Would it work in terms of immediate displacement? I don't know, but I think it's something that we need to think about in terms of reducing the amount of time that we travel between places.
Yeah, I'll just add real quick. I think it's a really important question. If there's not planning and thought about what this will look like, we'll just get what we get. And I feel like this is a role for the university to play in terms of thinking ahead. What would we like to have happen? What's for the good of the nation, and how can we kind of get ahead of it and have some kind of ideas put out there for policies or plans for doing this well, rather than reacting quickly to disaster or just long-term change that we think is going to happen.
So do we need specialists in climate migration at the university?
So Bill Basner, faculty in the School of Data Science, and my area is remote sensing, which I used for a number of natural disasters like the 2010 Haiti earthquake. And so I was wondering what role you might see for remote sensing in remediation and protection and what you're talking about. And I'll suggest three modalities. So there's a company called Planet Sky, which put up about 200 small satellites on the SpaceX systems. And so their goal is to image every square inch of populated Earth every few hours. So high revisit rate, low resolution. So you can count cars in a parking lot, but you can't delineate specific cars. Or a company called Orbital Sidekick that launched its first of 6 hyperspectral satellites. So each pixel in those, you can do spectroscopy. So their goal is to identify methane in the atmosphere in places. So I was wondering, and LiDAR is another really good remote sensing technology if you're familiar with that. So the question is, what role do you see either remote sensing or AI machine learning information that you can get from remote sensing data in this sphere?
That's you, John.
Okay. We were talking before, so I've got a little bit of a
Got a heads up.
Got a heads up on this. No, I use remote sensing a lot. I think a lot of environmental folks, engineers, and scientists do. Just a couple things that come to mind quickly is dunes on beaches. How are they changing over time? Beach nourishment projects that are happening to protect communities. Just monitoring that and knowing how it's responding and changing could be something really helpful for communities, knowing where to put investments. I did a project not too long ago for the Virginia Department of Transportation, trying to figure out where wetlands are. right? When they build a new road, they want to avoid wetlands, of course, but there's not really good information where they are. And how can we quickly assess over large areas where are the wetlands and how are those changing? That will be incredibly important to monitor in coming years and decades. And so the ability to measure these things through remote sensing and drones and data collection methods that we haven't had in the past, together with the ability to analyze them at scale using AI remote machine learning approaches, I think is a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of what is changing, how fast on the landscape at a scale that matters to decision makers. So.
And I would just add, this goes back to the question Liz McGill asked, which is how do we use those modalities to forecast, to predict what future conditions might be and how individual places and people in those places might be at risk. And so that, again, is something that we don't do well yet on timescales that matter for communities.
I would just add one thing to this, that I think that the use of remote sensing, we also need to find ways to integrate it with much more localized sensing, just to understand the differentiation in these different environments. And then the other part I would just advocate for is that we're always looking at methods that are open and transparent in terms of the data storage, access to the data, and things like this, that it allows not only the university community to use this data, but kind of a broad range of people to audit it and see the information.
Michael Allen, Religious Studies. I'm emboldened Karen McGlathery.
Yeah.
Oh, Michael Allen, Religious Studies. I'm emboldened since Karen McGlathery had said she hoped someone from the humanities would speak up. I just wanted to put in a brief word for how essential I think the humanities are, especially when we're thinking about human communities and the lives that are at stake, environmental ethics, values. And I've thought throughout today's event about the analogy of the moonshot, is when you think about the moon landing, right? That wasn't just a scientific problem. You think about the cultural buy-in that was necessary for that, the place symbolically the moon landing occupies in imagination. You think about decades of science fiction people were reading that fired the imagination. So I think it's essential that we think about values and imagination and the humanities in these questions. Concrete question. Interdisciplinarity, we've heard, is important, many people have said. What are your ideas for concretely this unique opportunity for funding we have? What are the best ways to promote that kind of interdisciplinarity? It's hard, right, getting people who work on similar problems but from a variety of different approaches. And what do you see as the best ways to promote that kind of systemic interdisciplinary work? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I got, it's a little hard with masks, but I think I got it. Thank you very much for the comment about the importance of humanities and arts, and then what are different ways that we can promote that interdisciplinarity across grounds, across disciplines and schools. Does anybody want to take that?
I would just start with something that I think we're doing well, and ERI actually does well, which is provide research funding for interdisciplinary teams that haven't had an opportunity to work together in the past. That often takes a long time to play out and provide benefits, and sometimes those benefits are more measurable or tangible than in others, but I think that's a reasonable starting point for that whole process. And the other thing is convening events and convening conversations across disciplines and bringing together diverse panels. The honest truth is I've gotten to know these four people a lot better through the process of thinking through this panel alone. And we're building trust, we're building shared conversations, and I think that's going to have real implications over the long run.
I would just add to that list leadership training. I think interdisciplinary dialogues are quite difficult to have because we all work in our silos with our acronyms, and it needs expertise from leaders to really bring those disciplines together and make the bridges, make the kind of conceptual leaps that are required. I think it requires training, in essence.
I'd add two things to that. It's a really great question. I think we call it a test bed in engineering. I don't know if that word resonates across disciplines, but some place that we're all coming together around is a really helpful thing. So whether it's a particular city or community that people are interested in engaging with from their own perspective, it can become this uniting thing at some level. So I think that could be really, really helpful. Yeah, I said ERI times 5, and Karen did not ask me to say that earlier, but I meant ERI is doing a really great job at this, but it could do more. Like, I don't know, the engagement with humanities in particular could potentially be strengthened, but I think we got a really good foundation that we can expand on for it. But the last thing I'll say is, my experience in the Link Lab, which is actually a space within the engineering school where faculty members gave up offices within their departments and came into this interdisciplinary lab, and their students came as well. That's actually really helpful to facilitate a lot of conversations that you wouldn't otherwise have. So I'm wondering, in my mind, for some of these long-term challenges, is some kind of physical space where those that want to have these conversations can actually kind of co-locate in a way and spend time. Like, we just had a panel and we learned so much about one another. What if we actually kind of did our academic life together and had conversations? That would be a really, I think, cool thing to do if people are willing to do it.
If I could just add 2 other points. One is the value and the need for long-term commitments of engagement across, faculty members or groups of faculty, that it's not just a quick thing and then you run off and do your other. So to your question, I think that's a good way of framing it. How could we build those long-term conversations and collaborations? And the other that I would say that this is that, we're talking about research and scholarship. We're talking about not just raising money for external research, although that's extremely important, and getting publications, but it's also about, how we are impacting communities, how we are engaging communities, how we're impacting policy. So in addition to the traditional research outputs that the university needs and we all need, it's the sort of engagement part of it. I think that's really important. So think about what those metrics are and maybe having an expanded conversation that would bring more people in. Yes?
Hi, I'm Brendan. I'm with the Center for Social Innovation at the Batten School. A big part of this panel so far has been flood risk and sea level rise. But when I think of climate change, I also think of like fires, food security, drought, and like water access. So I'm curious, one, if you could situate that among, or I guess relative to flood risk and sea level rise, and then 2, talk about how you would incorporate that into some of these questions about human migration patterns.
Yeah, I think if I could sort of reframe that just slightly to think about, essentially we're talking about climate extremes. It's not just sea level rise and storms on the coast, but these are climate extremes, and they could be a drought. Larry Band has worked on that, and China. I mean, there are and heat waves. That's a big issue in cities. I don't know, Jenny, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So some of the scenarios we're talking about, say green infrastructure in terms of mitigating sea level rise, are also going to have an incredible effect on heat stress. So greening of our cities is particularly something close to me, and the health and well-being benefits that brings. I think it's that all the issues we've talked about relate to some of those themes. So, fires result in displacement, and that results in communities having to receive those people who are being displaced. So there are many, I think, layers of synthesis across the different themes that you've mentioned. I don't have anything else immediately to add, but I'll think about it.
Yeah, I have been careful. Maybe I've made a few mistakes to use the word risk without specifying what I intended. And it is absolutely the case that risk not only involves not just flood risk, it involves fire risk, it involves drought, it involves heat stress, it involves all sorts of things, and many different types of scholars are focused on different endpoints. The key thing to note is that for different areas and for different questions we're talking about, fundamentally, these things all translate into different types of risk for different places at different times with different severity for different populations. And understanding the implications of that is going to be incredibly complicated, and we are fortunate to have such smart people here to help us figure it out.
I'll just add, it's probably my bad because I think about flooding a lot. So that's probably why the conversation went that way. But yeah, you're exactly right. It's larger than just that.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Come on. Yes, Howie.
Yeah, thank you. Howie Epstein from Environmental Sciences. I was wondering if you could maybe just build on things you had just started talking about, and that is, are you thinking about this from a global perspective? Are you thinking about differences in existing infrastructure, differences in cultures, differences in environments? When I hear somebody from the University of Virginia talk about coasts, I think the Virginia coast. But how broad is your thinking here?
I mean, I'm thinking. Kind of the discussion today is thinking a bit locally in terms of kind of applied research in the Commonwealth. But I would assume all of us are thinking globally in regards to how that research transfers and how we might engage it. So I think it goes way beyond Virginia or even North America, and it thinks globally about how we start to talk about resilient cities and this idea of migration.
The notion of the distributional consequences of climate change, when you think about sort of equity issues associated with climate change and climate change policy, the intersection of climate change with billions of people living on $2 a day or less is, I think, really one of humanity's greatest challenges moving forward. And so I think about those issues a lot when I frame these conversations. I don't have particular institutional expertise outside of the United States, but I think those are absolutely crucial issues. The other thing to recognize is when we think about the implications of climate change, many of the low-lying areas, densely populated low-lying areas like Bangladesh or Oceania, these are relatively vulnerable populations to begin with. And so all of the challenges we talk about in the context of the United States, especially when we're talking about adaptation, these are enormous global challenges looking forward and in truth already.
I'll just add, I think my thinking has been local just because of the community engagement piece of it is also really important to me. And it's just obviously easier to do that in a local way. But I think it should be global focus that we have. I have a number of students from Bangladesh, and I would love opportunities to kind of dig in more deeply to what's happening there. How does it contrast with what's happening in the U.S. and kind of what would flood modeling look like in that environment? So I think it's just a lack of time really for me personally. But I'm sure if you had other panelists up here who could take on a more global perspective as well. So I don't want to lose that local perspective, because I think we do have a mission to really help the Commonwealth of Virginia and think through things. And there's some advantages to doing that. But I would be, I don't think it's right to only have that focus, of course.
Jenny, any parting?
Well, just from a behavioral perspective, what you're talking about is huge. And, most of this research is done in the developing countries, and we know so little, really, about people's experiences in the global south. So it's really important that we invest in understanding cultural perspectives to this issue and cultural responses to it, and how we shift individual behaviors in other parts of the world. We've no idea at the minute, really.
Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up this panel. I just wanted to highlight a few things that I heard and sort of build from the previous panel, and hopefully will be a transition to the next panel. But we've certainly heard, like with the previous panel, about the critical need for a systems level approach, and the question about not just being a city, but thinking about the city in its context, thinking about predicting climate risk and response to climate risk, whatever that risk is, that extreme, in a way that's very dynamic. And so thinking about how do we model it? How do we visualize it? How do we plan for it? How do we incorporate that uncertainty? And then I guess the last thing I think that we'll transition into the next climate and democracy panel is this, that we heard in the previous panel and this panel, the really important aspect of community engagement. So it's not enough for us to just sit here in this beautiful dome room and do it, but to actually get out and work with communities, to think about how to link the biophysical, the social, behavioral, the cultural, the spiritual aspects of different locations, whether we're here in the Commonwealth or whether we're somewhere else in the world. So we'll end this panel, and then I guess we have a 15-minute break, And then we'll start the climate and democracy panel at 3:50. Thanks, everyone.